Alright, we're going to begin by just basically blocking in the masses of the chest and back. So a lot of that really is here, but it's not very detailed. So we want to start by thinking about how massive we want our barbarian to be. Now, even though the guy is swinging a broadsword around all the time, if we want him to be kind of light on his feet and nimble, we're going to have to keep him at least somewhat lean. So as we block in these masses, we want to think about making sure that we do work on both sides of the mesh at the same time. So we're going to want to make sure that our x-axis mirroring is turned on. That way when I work on one side of the mesh, I'm also working on the other side. So let's just drag around here and see, oh yes, our strength is set way too high. So I'm going to bring that down, bring our brush size down a bit as well. Now as we work, we're going to see that detail happen way more slowly. Alright, so we can start to just block things in. Now again, as I look around, I'm seeing that that's still going a little too fast. So at least for here, we're going to kind of slow it down a bit. We're going to smooth that back in. We're just going to make sure that as we start to block this in, we're just not going to go too crazy too quickly. So between some of the multiple brushes here, we want to start really looking at the flow of that musculature and making sure that things are actually going where we want them to. Now, things were modeled pretty accurately in 3ds Max, but it's still always nice once we start sculpting to really start looking at human anatomy and making sure that things are flowing in the direction that we want. Now, the mesh is pretty low res still, so we're not going to get a ton of detail out of this, but we do want to make sure that we're really starting to block in where those forms are. So we need to kind of redirect the collarbone. Push that back into the mesh a little bit more. If we move around the back, we need to think about the deltoid and how the mass of that really does come farther back on the back of our model. Now, as we just do this, we want it to be rough, right? We're not worried now about any kind of specific detail. We just want to rough things in so we start to get a real good idea of where and how these masses are overlapping each other. So I hold down the control key, I'll basically carve in rather than pulling out. Pulling that armpit up and in allows me to basically work and control a little bit more about how that lat muscle is going to transition into and under the deltoid muscle. Alright, I think to block this in anymore, we're going to need to subdivide a little bit more. So I'm going to hit Shift D and subdivide again. So I'm still only at 70,000 polygons, but now when I sculpt, I should have a bit more control. So I still don't want to do any real detail sculpting, but I do want to be able to really start to define those masses. So always checking the transitions and how things flow back into the mesh. Get a little less strong. So they were kind of defining where the collarbones meet up to the sternum. You know, as a start, that's really not too bad. We just need to continue to look at how these muscle masses actually work on a real human. So this piece here, and actually we're going to cut in just a little bit. So with the sculpt brush and holding down control, I can carve negative, and then as we smooth that out, we're starting to think about basically the middle head and the anterior head of the deltoid muscle. So as we carve that in, we'll start to get more of a feel of how the pectoralis muscle inserts underneath the deltoid, as well as on top of the bicep. So I would suggest that you have a good collection of human anatomy reference images at your disposal while you're sculpting, so that you can constantly be looking back and forth and have a good understanding of how all of these muscle masses interact and overlap and work together to define the forms of the human body. Alright, so that would be the posterior head here of the deltoid muscle. And all of that wraps around the shoulder and inserts at the top of the arm between the biceps and the triceps. So when I'm working, I tend to just kind of sculpt things big and then smooth it back out. So it allows me to do some kind of big picture editing without really worrying about anything being too hyper accurate. I mean, we are modeling a barbarian, so we're not worried about anything being absolutely precise, but being able to see this much muscle mass on our character, if it's not at least close to reality, it's going to be obvious that it's just not realistic at all. So we want to at least attempt to follow the basics of reality, and we can always exaggerate and push things beyond, but we want to start with a good understanding of what reality is so that we can intelligently go beyond reality. Let's see, now on the back, we have some kind of smaller bulging muscles that stick out in spots that we're not going to worry about too much detail. But I do want to start actually adding some bulk here around the spine. So as we start to bulk this up a little bit, and then bring this transition down into the width of that big lat muscle that ends up looking like wings sticking out, we want to bulk that up. And then again, smooth it back in. So I'm going to leave the edge here that sticks out into the side of the body. We'll leave that a little bit more massive, but here, the transition into the spine, we want to smooth that back out. So we're going to keep some of the mass that we pulled out, but always looking to kind of smooth things back in. Alright, that's not too bad. This is going to end up needing to come a little bit thicker around the side there. So we get a few faces flickering here and there as we sculpt and smooth, but that just comes down to the amount of detail that we actually have on the mesh right now. Alright, so that's a good kind of basic, rough blocking phase for the upper body.